There is a battle happening inside many people right now. A battle no one sees, but almost everyone feels. You try to move on. You try to be disciplined. You try to pray, focus, stay pure. But something keeps pulling you back into the same cycle. A thought comes, then another. And before you realize it, you're trapped again in a loop of desire, guilt, and regret. And the hardest question starts to echo in your mind. Why can't I stop lusting, even when I know it's destroying me? This is not just about weakness. It's not just about lack of control. And it's definitely not just about physical desire. There is something deeper happening, something spiritual, psychological, and emotional all at once. Because if it was only about willpower, you would have already stopped, but you didn't. And that's why this truth matters more than anything you've heard before. What if the problem is not that you are too weak, but that you are fighting the wrong understanding of desire itself? What if what you call lust is actually a distorted hunger trying to speak to a deeper emptiness inside you? Today, the biblical truth about this struggle will be revealed, and it may completely change how you see yourself, your thoughts, and your battle forever. When you start to understand lust correctly, something important shifts inside you. Because the real problem is not that you feel desire. The real issue is what that desire has become over time. Lust is not simply attraction. It is not just the body reacting. It is a hunger that has been disconnected from its original purpose, and when something natural loses its purpose, it becomes destructive. In its pure form, desire is actually created by God. It is meant to lead you toward love, connection, commitment, and meaning. It is supposed to be something that builds life, not breaks it. But lust is what happens when that same desire is pulled out of its proper place and turned into something selfish, instant, and uncontrolled. It no longer seeks connection. It only seeks release. It no longer values meaning. It only wants momentary satisfaction. And that is why it feels so powerful and so difficult to stop, because it is no longer operating in its natural design. The truth is, lust always promises satisfaction, but it never delivers it. It creates a cycle where the moment feels intense, almost like relief or escape. But immediately after that moment passes, something feels missing. You don't feel full, you feel emptier than before. And that emptiness is what pulls you back again. This is why people get stuck in repetition. It is not just temptation returning. It is the feeling of incompleteness returning. Spiritually speaking, this is what makes lust so dangerous. It trains the mind to chase something that cannot satisfy the soul. And when the soul is not satisfied, no amount of physical experience can fix it. That is why, even after giving in, there is regret, confusion, and guilt. Because deep inside, you know this is not what you were created for. You were created for something higher, something deeper, something that lasts. But there is another layer to this struggle that many people never realize. Lust doesn't just attack randomly, it grows in silence. It feeds on loneliness, boredom, emotional pain, stress, and unhealed wounds. It uses those moments when you are weakest, not because it is stronger than you, but because it has learned your patterns. It knows when you are alone. It knows when your mind is idle. And slowly, it builds a connection in your brain between emotional discomfort and temporary escape. So instead of dealing with pain, the mind begins to run toward distraction. That is how a distorted hunger is formed. And the more it is repeated, the more natural it feels. What once felt like a choice slowly starts to feel like an urge you cannot control. But the truth is, this is not who you are. It is a trained response, not your identity. It is a pattern, not your purpose. And anything that is learned can also be unlearned. This is why understanding lust correctly is the first step toward freedom. Because you cannot overcome something you misunderstand. When you see it for what it really is, not a need, not a destiny, not your identity, but a distorted hunger trying to replace something deeper, then you stop fearing it and you start seeing through it. And once you see through it, its power over you begins to break. Once you understand that lust is a distorted hunger, the next truth becomes even deeper and more confronting. Because what you are fighting is not only psychological or emotional, it is also spiritual in nature. This is where most people misunderstand their struggle. They think they are simply dealing with thoughts, habits, or lack of discipline. But in reality, there is a deeper battle happening in the unseen realm of the mind and spirit, where every thought becomes a seed, and every repeated thought becomes a stronghold. The Bible does not treat the mind lightly. It repeatedly emphasizes that the mind is the battlefield of spiritual transformation, not because thoughts are harmless, but because thoughts shape identity, behavior, and destiny. When Scripture says to take every thought captive, it is revealing something very important. Thoughts are not meant to control you. You are meant to observe, challenge, and direct them. But when thoughts are left unchecked, they don't remain thoughts for long. They become imaginations, and imaginations become cravings, and cravings eventually become actions. That is the silent progression most people never notice until they are already trapped in the cycle. This is why lust feels so powerful at times. It doesn't always start as action. It starts as suggestion, a moment of boredom, a glance, a memory, a trigger. And then the mind begins to replay, amplify, and construct scenarios. At first, it feels harmless, almost automatic. But what is really happening is that neural pathways are being reinforced. Spiritually speaking, what you meditate on repeatedly begins to shape your inner world. And once the inner world is shaped, the outer behavior follows naturally. This is also where the struggle becomes confusing, because people often think, if I don't want this, why am I still thinking it? But thoughts are not always reflections of desire. They are often reflections of exposure, memory, and habit. The mind is constantly processing what it has seen, heard, and experienced, and without awareness, it replays what is familiar, not what is healthy. This is why temptation often feels repetitive. It is not new every time. It is recycled patterns appearing in different forms. Spiritually, this is where the battle becomes about authority. Not just resisting temptation, but deciding what has permission to live in your mind. Because whatever dominates your thoughts eventually influences your spirit. And when the spirit becomes weakened by constant internal conflict, discipline becomes harder, clarity becomes weaker, and emotional control becomes unstable. That is why some people feel like they are losing control even when they are trying hard. They are fighting the symptoms, not the source. The deeper truth is this: your mind is not just a thinking space. It is a forming space. What you repeatedly allow inside becomes part of your internal structure. And once a pattern is formed, it begins to operate automatically, almost like a hidden script running in the background. This is why lust can feel automatic, even when you don't consciously want it. It is not your identity acting. It is a conditioned system responding. But here is the powerful spiritual truth that brings hope into this struggle. Anything formed in the mind can also be transformed. Because the same way patterns are built through repetition, they are also broken through intentional renewal. This is why Scripture speaks about renewing the mind, not just controlling behavior, because real transformation does not begin on the surface. It begins in the unseen layers where thoughts are shaped, interpreted, and repeated. And when you finally realize this, something shifts. You stop seeing yourself as powerless against thoughts, and you start seeing yourself as someone who has authority over what stays and what leaves. The battle is no longer about fighting every thought. It is about refusing to give repeated life to the thoughts that were never meant to define you. Now, when you start looking honestly at your struggle, there is a moment of confusion that hits many people deeply. Because even after understanding the spiritual and mental side of lust, the question still remains, if I know all of this, why do I still fall into it? And this is where the hidden cycle reveals itself, the part of the struggle that most people never recognize clearly, yet it is the very reason they feel powerless. What you are dealing with is not a single moment of temptation. It is a cycle that has been quietly built over time, layer by layer, until it starts operating automatically in the background of your life. It usually begins with something small, an emotional trigger, maybe stress, loneliness, boredom, rejection, or even just fatigue. In that moment, the mind looks for relief, something to escape the discomfort. And then a thought appears. Not always strong, not always obvious, just a suggestion, a memory, a curiosity, a visual impression, something subtle. But the problem is not the thought itself. The problem is what happens when the thought is not interrupted. Because if it is left alone, it doesn't stay small. It grows. It begins to form images, scenarios, fantasies, and emotional stimulation. The mind starts to engage with it, almost like watching something internally, and slowly, without realizing it, emotional energy begins to attach itself to that thought. What started as a passing idea becomes an experience in the mind. And once the emotional system is activated, discipline weakens. Not because you suddenly became weaker, but because the brain has shifted into a different state. It is no longer thinking logically, it is now responding emotionally. At that point, resistance feels harder, clarity feels blurred, and decision-making feels delayed. This is why many people say, "I don't even know how it happened," because by the time awareness returns, the cycle has already progressed far ahead. Then comes the action, the moment of release, followed by a temporary sense of relief. But that relief is short-lived. Very quickly, reality returns, and with it comes guilt, regret, self-judgment, and emotional heaviness. This is where the cycle resets, but not in a neutral way. It resets with emotional damage, and that damage becomes the next trigger, because now the mind is not only dealing with external stress, but also internal shame. And shame is one of the strongest fuels for repetition. So the cycle continues. Trigger, thought, fantasy, emotional escalation, action, guilt, and then repeat. Over time, this cycle becomes so familiar that it feels like identity. You begin to think, this is just how I am. But that is the deception of repetition. Something that happens often starts to feel natural, even when it is not your true nature. And here is the most important part. The feeling of powerlessness does not come from lack of strength. It comes from lack of interruption. Because what makes this cycle strong is not the temptation itself, but the fact that it is allowed to complete itself again and again without resistance at the right point. Most people try to fight it at the final stage, when it is already too late. But real control begins much earlier, at the first thought, the first image, the first emotional shift. When you understand this, you begin to see clearly that you are not weak, you are conditioned. And anything that is conditioned can be interrupted, because the cycle only survives when it is completed. And the moment you learn where to break it, you start reclaiming control not through force, but through awareness. After understanding the cycle, something very important must be confronted, because this is where real transformation either begins or fails. Many people assume that freedom from lust comes through stronger discipline, stricter rules, or more self-control. But the Bible reveals a deeper truth that most people overlook completely. The real battle is not just about resisting temptation. It is about renewing the inner world that produces it. There is a powerful principle hidden throughout Scripture that says, transformation does not begin with behavior correction, but with mind renewal. This is why it is written, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Notice what it does not say. It does not say, "Be transformed by trying harder." It does not say, "Be transformed by suppressing desire." It says, "renewal," meaning something inside must be replaced, reshaped, and reprogrammed at the source level. Because if the mind remains unchanged, behavior will always eventually return to its old patterns. You can suppress urges for a time. You can resist temptation through effort, but anything that is only controlled and not transformed will eventually resurface when pressure increases. This is why many people experience temporary victory, followed by repeated relapse. The outer fight is being won for a moment, but the inner system remains unchanged. Biblically speaking, the mind is not a passive space. It is a forming system. What enters repeatedly becomes what feels normal, and what feels normal eventually becomes what feels acceptable. That is how spiritual and mental conditioning works over time. So if the mind continues to consume the same patterns, the same images, the same emotional triggers, then even if a person tries to change externally, internally, they are still being shaped by the same influences. This is why the Bible focuses so heavily on what you set your mind on. Because what you consistently focus on becomes the direction of your inner life. And when the direction of the inner life is unchanged, the external struggle remains the same. You cannot expect a new outcome while feeding the same mental environment that created the old outcome. That is not how transformation works, spiritually or psychologically. And here is where the deeper truth becomes both challenging and freeing. You are not meant to simply fight what is wrong. You are meant to replace it with what is right. The mind does not become empty, it becomes occupied. So if you only remove without replacing, the space remains vulnerable. This is why many people feel stronger for a while and then suddenly fall again. Because the mind, when left without intentional renewal, naturally returns to familiar patterns. Renewal means actively reshaping what your mind is exposed to, what it meditates on, what it values, and what it repeatedly imagines. It is not a one-time decision. It is a continuous realignment. And slowly, as new patterns are formed, old patterns begin to lose their authority, not because they are forced out, but because they are replaced at the root level. This is also where grace becomes important, because biblical transformation is not just human effort, it is also divine assistance working alongside willingness. But that willingness must be present. You cannot expect change while still feeding the same internal environment that sustains the struggle. At some point, something must shift in what you allow to shape your inner world. And when that shift begins, something powerful happens. The struggle does not just feel resisted, it starts to feel weakened. Not because temptation disappears instantly, but because its influence loses depth. It stops feeling like identity and starts feeling like interference. And that is the beginning of real transformation, not when temptation is gone, but when it no longer defines the direction of your mind. When you go deeper into this struggle, beyond the surface of thoughts, cycles, and spiritual battles, you eventually reach something even more personal and more uncomfortable to admit. Because at its core, lust is rarely just about physical desire. It is often about something far deeper that the heart is trying to find but cannot properly identify. It is a search for fulfillment that has been directed toward the wrong source. Most people assume the struggle is purely about temptation, but if you look closely, there are moments when lust appears the strongest. Not in moments of joy, but in moments of emptiness. When you are alone, when you are stressed, when you feel unseen, unwanted, or emotionally disconnected. In those moments, the mind begins to search for something that can quickly fill the gap. Not necessarily something meaningful, but something immediate, something that numbs the discomfort, even for a short time. And this is where the deeper truth is revealed. Lust often functions as a substitute for emotional relief, not just physical craving. This is why it becomes so repetitive, because it is not solving the real problem. It is only temporarily covering it. The human soul was created with a need for connection, purpose, identity, and love. But when those deeper needs feel unmet, the mind looks for shortcuts. It looks for something that can simulate connection without requiring real vulnerability, something that gives the feeling of escape without requiring real healing. And in that search, lust becomes a false solution that promises comfort but delivers emptiness. And that is the part most people don't see clearly in the moment, because the experience feels like control, but underneath it is often a form of escape. Escape from loneliness, escape from stress, escape from internal conflict, escape from emotional pain that has not been processed. But the problem with escape is that it does not resolve anything. It only delays the confrontation with what is actually missing inside. This is why, after the moment passes, there is often a strange silence. Not satisfaction, but a drop in emotional energy. Because deep inside, the real need was not addressed. The soul was not truly fed. Only the impulse was satisfied for a brief moment. And so the emptiness returns, sometimes even stronger than before. And that stronger emptiness becomes the trigger for the next cycle. This is where the struggle becomes confusing, because people start believing they are simply addicted to the act itself. But in many cases, they are actually attached to the emotional relief it temporarily provides. It becomes a conditioned response to discomfort, a way of saying, I don't want to feel this right now. But avoiding feeling does not remove the feeling. It only postpones it, and often intensifies it later. And here is the deeper truth that must be understood. When the heart is searching for fulfillment in the wrong place, no amount of repetition will ever create peace. You can repeat the cycle 100 times, and it will still leave the same gap, because the gap was never physical. It was emotional and spiritual. That is why the cycle continues, even when logic says it should stop. But this realization is also where hope begins to enter. Because if lust is a misplaced search for fulfillment, then the answer is not just suppression, it is redirection. The need for connection does not disappear, it must be fulfilled correctly. The need for meaning does not vanish, it must be realigned. The need for emotional relief does not end, it must be healed at its root instead of temporarily numbed. And when you begin to see it this way, something inside you changes. You stop viewing yourself as someone simply fighting desire, and you start seeing yourself as someone searching for something real, but in the wrong direction. And once you understand the direction is wrong, the possibility of finding the right direction finally opens up. At this point in the journey, something becomes very clear, something most people only realize after years of struggle. And it is this: trying to overcome lust through strength alone is never a complete solution. Because if strength was enough, you would have already been free. There would be no repetition, no relapse, no hidden cycle pulling you back. But the fact that the struggle continues reveals something deeper. Your battle is not just about effort, it is about foundation. Many people enter this fight with determination. They promise themselves, this time I will stop. They rely on motivation, discipline, even fear of consequences. And for a while, it works. There is control, there is resistance, there is progress. But then life happens. Stress increases, emotions fluctuate, loneliness returns, fatigue sets in, and in that weakened state, the same patterns reappear. Not because the person suddenly stopped caring, but because willpower was carrying a burden it was never designed to carry alone. Strength without direction eventually collapses under pressure. Because willpower is not infinite, it is influenced by emotional energy, mental clarity, and spiritual stability. When those internal systems are not aligned, even strong intentions struggle to survive consistently. That is why many people experience cycles of victory and failure. It is not a lack of desire to change. It is a lack of internal structure supporting that change. The deeper truth is that lust is not only a desire problem, it is also a focus problem and a fulfillment problem. And when those deeper layers are not addressed, resistance becomes exhausting. You begin to feel like you are constantly fighting yourself. One part of you wants freedom, while another part keeps returning to old patterns. And that internal conflict drains your energy over time, making consistency harder to maintain. This is why relying only on suppression creates frustration. Because suppression without transformation means you are constantly saying no to something without replacing what it is pointing toward. And the human mind cannot exist in a constant state of denial. It needs direction, not just restriction. It needs something higher to move toward, not just something lower to avoid. That is why strength alone feels incomplete. It focuses only on stopping behavior, not reshaping desire. But desire itself does not disappear. It must be redirected. If it is not redirected, it will eventually find its way back through another path, often when your defenses are weakest. This is why even people with strong discipline sometimes fall unexpectedly. Because discipline without internal renewal is like building walls without changing what is inside the room. And here is the part that changes everything. Real transformation does not come from fighting harder, but from becoming different internally. When your thoughts change, your values shift. When your values shift, your decisions follow naturally. When your internal environment changes, external behavior starts to align without constant force. That is why some people eventually find that what once felt like a constant battle becomes less intense. Not because temptation disappeared, but because its influence weakened through transformation. This is where purpose becomes essential. Because when the mind is not anchored in something meaningful, it will always drift back to what is familiar. Purpose gives direction to desire. It turns energy into focus instead of distraction. And without that direction, even strong willpower eventually runs out of clarity. So the real realization is this: you were never meant to rely on strength alone. You were meant to grow into someone whose inner world no longer feeds the same cycle. Because when the foundation changes, the struggle does not just become manageable, it begins to lose its authority over you. Now, everything you have understood so far leads to one final turning point. The place where struggle either becomes transformation or continues in cycles. Because if lust is not only a physical urge, not only a mental loop, and not only an emotional escape, then the solution cannot be limited to surface-level effort either. There must be a deeper path, a deeper process, something that works at the root instead of just trimming the branches. And this is exactly where the biblical principle of renewal becomes the key to real freedom. Renewal is not about trying to control what already feels out of control. It is not about constantly fighting thoughts as they appear. It is about changing the source from which those thoughts are being formed. Because every thought has a source, and every desire has an origin. If the source remains unchanged, the output will always repeat itself in different forms. That is why Scripture does not say, "control your mind" as the final solution. It says, "renew your mind." Because control is temporary, but renewal is transformation. To renew something means to replace what is old with what is new at the foundational level. It is not just removal, it is substitution. And this is where many people miss the true path. They try to empty the mind without filling it, to resist desire without redirecting it, to remove patterns without replacing them. But an empty mind is never neutral. It always gravitates toward what is familiar, and if the familiar patterns are not replaced with new ones, the cycle eventually returns. This is why renewal is an active process. It is about intentionally reshaping what your mind consumes, what it reflects on, and what it repeatedly imagines. Because your inner world is constantly being built, whether you are aware of it or not. Every image you allow, every thought you entertain, every emotion you repeatedly revisit, they are all contributing to the structure of your internal life, and over time, that structure becomes your default response system. The path to freedom, therefore, is not just about resisting temptation when it appears. It is about changing what your mind naturally returns to when it is idle. Because most struggles do not happen in moments of strong discipline. They happen in moments of weakness, boredom, fatigue, and emotional vulnerability. And in those moments, the mind will always go to whatever has been most frequently reinforced. That is why renewal requires consistency, not intensity. It is not about one powerful decision. It is about repeated alignment. Slowly, intentionally, what you expose your mind to begins to shift. What once felt attractive begins to lose influence. What once felt automatic begins to feel foreign. Not because temptation disappears instantly, but because its foundation inside you is being weakened over time. And in this process, something very important begins to happen. You stop living reactively and start living intentionally. Instead of being pulled by impulses, you begin to notice them earlier. Instead of being controlled by cycles, you begin to interrupt them sooner. Instead of feeling like a victim of your thoughts, you begin to observe them with clarity. This is what renewal produces, not perfection, but awareness, not instant freedom, but gradual transformation, and most importantly, not external pressure, but internal change, because when the mind is renewed, the same situations no longer produce the same reactions. And that is when the real shift happens. The struggle does not disappear overnight, but its power over you begins to fade. And slowly, what once felt like a constant battle starts becoming something you can finally see clearly. And what you can see clearly, you can begin to overcome. Now we arrive at the final truth, the one that can completely change the way you see yourself, your struggle, and your entire inner battle. Because after everything has been understood, the distorted hunger, the spiritual battle, the hidden cycle, the emotional emptiness, and the need for renewal, there is still one final misunderstanding that must be broken. And it is this: the belief that you are your urges. This is where many people silently lose the battle, not because they lack awareness, but because they misidentify themselves with what they experience. A thought appears, and immediately they assume, "This is me." A desire rises, and they conclude, "This is who I am." A moment of weakness happens, and they define themselves through it. But this is the deepest illusion in the entire struggle. Because experiencing an urge is not the same as becoming it. Feeling temptation is not the same as being controlled by it, and having thoughts is not the same as belonging to them. The truth is, your mind produces thoughts the same way the sky produces weather. Storms appear, clouds gather, winds rise, but the sky does not become the storm. It simply holds it temporarily. In the same way, your awareness is not the urge itself. It is the space in which the urge appears. But when identification is lost, every passing impulse begins to feel like identity. And once something feels like identity, it becomes much harder to resist, not because it is stronger, but because you have unconsciously accepted it as you. This is why so many people feel trapped, not because the urge is constantly winning, but because they stop seeing themselves as separate from it. And when you no longer see separation, you no longer create space to respond, you only react. But the moment awareness returns, something powerful becomes visible. There is the urge, and there is you observing it. There is the thought, and there is the one who notices it. There is the impulse, and there is the awareness that can choose. And that awareness is where freedom begins. Because urges are temporary. They rise, they peak, and they fade. But awareness is steady. It does not demand action. It does not force reaction. It simply observes. And in that observation, a gap is created. A space where choice becomes possible again. That gap is where transformation lives. Not in suppression, not in denial, but in recognition. The more you practice seeing your urges as separate from your identity, the weaker their emotional control becomes. Not because they stop appearing, but because they stop defining you. And when something no longer defines you, it no longer controls you in the same way. It becomes an experience, not a command. This is the deepest shift in the entire journey, moving from identification to observation. From "I am this urge" to "I am aware of this urge." That small shift changes everything. Because now, instead of being inside the cycle, you begin to stand beside it. Instead of being dragged by every impulse, you begin to see it forming before it fully takes over. And awareness always arrives before choice. And here is the final truth that brings everything together. You were never created to be controlled by passing thoughts. You were created to be conscious of them, to see them, understand them, and choose beyond them. Your urges may be loud, but they are not final. They may be strong, but they are not permanent. They may return, but they do not define your identity. So when the battle comes again, and it will, remember this: you are not the urge. You are not the thought. You are not the cycle. You are the one who notices them. And the one who notices is always greater than what is being noticed. So now everything comes together. What once felt like a personal failure, you can now see as a deeper struggle of the mind, emotions, and spirit working together in a broken cycle. You are not just fighting desire. You are navigating distorted hunger, hidden emotional wounds, repeated mental patterns, and a search for fulfillment that was never meant to be satisfied in the way lust promises. And this is the most important truth you must carry from this message. You were never created to be controlled by your urges. You were created to be aware of them, to rise above them, and to choose beyond them. Lust may return, thoughts may appear, and old patterns may try to pull you back, but none of these things define who you are. They are experiences, not identity. They are signals, not commands. And they are temporary, no matter how powerful they feel in the moment. Freedom does not come from becoming someone who never feels temptation. Freedom comes from becoming someone who is no longer ruled by it. Someone who can see clearly in the middle of the storm. Someone who understands that every urge has an end, but awareness remains. And slowly, as you begin to apply what you now understand, renewing your mind, breaking the cycle early, redirecting your focus, and refusing identification with urges, you will notice something powerful happening. The struggle does not disappear overnight, but its authority over you begins to weaken. What once felt like control starts becoming noise, and what once felt like identity starts becoming observation. This is the journey of transformation. Not perfection, but progress. Not instant change, but consistent renewal. And every time you choose awareness over reaction, you are not just resisting temptation, you are rebuilding your mind. So remember this when the battle returns. You are not your urges. You are not your thoughts. You are not your past cycles. You are the one who sees them, and the one who sees can always rise above.